Do you want to learn the secret to unlock highly detailed paint jobs? Well, today I'll teach you just that, as I go step by step on how I painted this model's skin and fabric. So let us waste no more time and get right to it. When it came to painting the muscles, throughout the whole process of base coating and highlighting, I always move my brush in the same direction within each muscle. That is, for example, from side to side on the chest and from top to bottom on the shoulders. This is done in order to help create the effect of muscle fibers underneath the skin. And even though the effect won't really take shape until further down the line, each layer counts, and directly affects whatever we put on top of it. Something already noticeable in my color scheme, as I'll be layering with semi-opaque mixes right from the get-go, which you'll see makes my base tone blend into that grey-green primer I started from, already giving my scheme the unhealthy look I'm after. Having gone over each muscle, I now want to bridge the gap between both colors, as well as add a bit of liveliness to the skin and establish my shadows. The most effective way to do that was through a wash, which I eyeballed mixing both my skin tone and grey-green, alongside some violet which will provide the liveliness I was looking for, though through a color tone which will work better with the pale skin I'm going for, in contrast to what a warm red would have done. Again, I eyeballed this mix, which also contained water and a drop of thinner medium I had laying around to make it more stable, though I ended up having to do a second pass with more violet in order to reach the intensity I was after for the deep recesses. The lesson here is to not fuss about achieving the perfect tone or recipe right from the get-go, and understanding that corrections are a necessary part of painting a model for the first time. Going back to the skin tone, I want you to pay close attention to those tiny dots at the end of my brushstroke. I talked about them recently on my cape painting tutorial, and they appear naturally as wherever we finish our brushstroke is where most of the paint will deposit. However, by unloading excess paint from the brush or loading just the right amount, which is somewhere up to halfway up the bristles, we can minimize this effect, which, if left unchecked, can create an uneven texture. This wouldn't be much of a problem if we wanted to transition to a brighter color or create highlights towards the brightest part of the model. However, in the particular case of the pectoral muscle, for example, where we establish from the get-go that we want to go from side to side, we are left with no other option other than to minimize this effect, or end up with an uneven first layer. Other than that, painting the scars was a matter of placing my brush sideways and lightly creasing the surface so that the brush would only catch the raised details. It is important for it, as with any edge highlight in general, that our paint is not too thin, or it would run along the edge recess due to the capillary action upon the brush touching the surface. Once I was finished with this first layer, I encountered a very common mistake that needs fixing, and that is that our shadows are the same throughout the whole body, which would make no sense when we compare the shoulders, which are completely exposed to the light, against the downward facing shadows of the belly or armpits. So, with that in mind, I fixed this by simply adding a couple of lines which connect one muscle to the next, wherever I felt the shadow was a bit too strong in regards to how I envisioned the light. Moving on with the highlights, now there are two more things to take into account as we go brighter. On one hand, we can start to divide the big muscle areas into multiples. Now, I don't know much about anatomy, but this model does have some slight recesses sculpted around the pectoral and the shoulders, which self-divide the muscles. So, just like beforehand, where the purple shadow would not have made sense in some areas, it is only now that we have established an intermediate tone that we can start to create those subdivisions, and in turn make the intermediate tone play the role both of highlight against the violet and shadow against the brighter highlights. On the other hand, we also want to focus our highlights towards the light source. So, with the sun above as the imaginary light source, you will see how as I go brighter and brighter, that on the abdominal area, for example, I work only from the midsection up, and later on the very top of each muscle. The same will be true all around, but is very evident on the abs, and this is what will further enhance the volume of the model and avoid it looking flat. Now, I know all of this explanation might feel overwhelming for some of you, or even unachievable. However, truth is, no matter the technique you are trying to replicate or learn, there is one tip that reigns above all others when it comes to becoming a better painter, and that is patience. Every miniature you see online that looks perfect, every smooth blend and every sharp edge, it wasn't done in a single sitting. It is the result of someone quietly repeating the same small movements, layer after layer, mistake after mistake. Under their hands, learn what their mind couldn't yet explain. You never rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And in miniature painting, your system is simply showing up, again and again, even when the progress feels invisible. Because patience isn't just waiting, it's trusting that each layer, each correction, each failed attempt is still moving you forward. Think about how the paint behaves under the brush, how each stroke builds on the one before it. You can't rush that. You can't skip to the finish line. The beauty of miniature painting is that it teaches you to slow down, to notice the difference between control and pressure, between letting go and overworking. Perfectionism whispers that what you're doing isn't enough, but it's a lie. Perfectionism kills progress. And it is true. Chasing perfect models only leads to frustration. What matters is finishing the one in front of you, learning from it and beginning again. Every painter you admire once struggled with the same things you are facing now. The difference is, they kept going. Not because they were confident, but because they were curious. So don't let impatience trick you into thinking you're not improving. Progress in painting doesn't happen in leaps, it happens in layers. Just like this model, one thin coat at a time. Moving on with the fabric, the first step consisted of cross-hatching the design over all of the strips of cloth. Now, if you're having trouble with achieving thin lines such as these, a lack of a nice pointy brush might not be the only issue. Proper stability, paint dilution, and paint load are as if not more important. So I've linked both my brush control and my paint dilution guides in the description. All the theory you'll need is there in videos which are no more than 5 minutes long. But back to the topic at hand, during this process I'll admit that thinking on if I went over an area once or twice was a bit of a headache, especially moving on to the third layer. But I remained patient and worked one area at a time. Another thing that worried me was that maybe I was covering up a lot of the previous work with each successive layer, and that maybe my initial lines should have been thicker while the latter ones as thin as possible. However, I would have gotten nothing done if I kept worrying. At the end, if things didn't look as good, it would have been a lesson learned for the next time. Plus, nothing impeded me from doing the necessary corrections afterwards. But just as I said before, that doesn't mean aiming for perfection, as you'll see that many of the lines that I'm doing are either wobbly on some areas or too close together on others. It didn't really matter, since after 3 layers and a bunch of built-up texture, I was very pleased with the end result. The next thing I wanted to do was both dirty the strips and enhance the shadows. I settled for a wash made of 3 parts water to 1 part brown paint, which I allowed to pull in the recesses, but more importantly glazed around the top half of the strips. If I wanted this glaze to look like dirt, it would have made more sense to glaze it towards the bottom, and if I wanted to create cast shadows, it would have been better to use another color. I ended up with a mix of both, which I don't dislike, though it feels a bit off. As a thank you for sticking around till this point, how about we quickly look at how I painted the rust and blood effects as a bonus. For the rust, I decided to switch it up from last week where I painted it using acrylics and instead used the pigment method, which is much simpler and gives a very dry result. I simply diluted the pigments with a bit of water and IPA, and applied them as I would any other wash. But before it was fully dry, I added a pinch of red pigment to the brown wash, and slapped it over the previous pigment layer to mix wet on wet. The same thing was done afterwards with the yellowish pigment, and once it was all dry, I sealed it in place with a coat of matte varnish. Now that I had a unified finish all around, I moved on to the shiny stuff, starting with a simple dry brush over the rust, just so to chip the edges and raise details. I always like to add a quick dry brush over my rust so that the surface looks like it has seen some wear, and that the rust has only built over on the recesses. Thanks to the matte varnish, this Blood for the Blood God technical paint with its glossy finish will stand out even more against the skin and fabric. Only thing special was to add 1 part of water for every 2 parts of paint. This made it a bit more runny and allowed it to flow better into the recesses against the crosses. Plus, made it just a bit transparent so all the texture and detail I painted would likely show through, and make the blood feel more real in regards to flowing out of the wound. And with that, today's video comes to an end. I left the wood details out as I soon plan to release a proper guide on painting wood, so look forward to that coming soon after I'm done with some special projects and I revisit the Pile of Shame diaries later down the month. With that said, thank you for watching and I hope you found the video helpful.